Hi, welcome back to Rambling Roxy's Adventures Through History. I promised you guys a little bit more about early Ohio settlement, and we had talked about how the French were here, and we were going to talk about how we were leading into the French and Indian War, because we have all kinds of wars coming up: the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and they're all tied together. And it's kind of funny how one thing affects one, and it just kind of creates a domino effect. And it sounds pretty confusing, but we're going to kind of sort out those details today and help you get a little bit more of an understanding of what was going on in Ohio and what role Ohio played in those wars. So to start off, this episode is going to be kind of talking about the Ohio Company and the French and Indian War. After hearing about all the natural resources, so all the fertile land, all the huge trees that we had here, we had trees that were really, really big here. There's still some ancient forests that are known around Ohio, but they won't tell us what the trees are. But they're, hundreds and hundreds of years old, and those trees are just really big, and they're really great for shipbuilding and other things. So they really wanted to come here and kind of get tapped into those natural resources that were existing in the Ohio Territory. The Ohio Territory wasn't just Ohio, it was Pennsylvania, parts of West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, like the Wisconsin areas. It was a huge area at the time, and not just what Ohio's boundaries are today. But the British colonists, they heard about all these things, and they wanted in on the action. So remember at this time that Virginia and the East Coast were British colonies belonging to England or Great Britain at that time. So what we think of as America was still part of the British colonies. And the French and the English have been enemies for hundreds of years. They've been duking it out and having wars across the channel for a long time. If not 1,000 years. I kind of forget how long, but it's been a long time that they've had a long history of disagreements going on. And the British weren't about to let the French get everything. So in 1748, the Ohio Company was formed by several wealthy individuals, including some members of George Washington's family. And they wanted to gain lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British government then granted 200,000 acres to this company to start their new venture near the Ohio River in what is now western Pennsylvania, with the idea that the king allowed them to do this if they split up the land between at least 1,000 families. They wanted to have several people living in this area, and they could buy it back from the king and then resell it to other people. But the deal was that they did this, they had to build a fort. So a couple years later, Christopher Gist was hired by the Ohio Company in 1750 to survey the land and set up relations for trade with the Native Americans. And that was an important part of coming in to settle the area. The French had already claimed Ohio for their own and were very upset about the Ohio Company coming into their territory. And in 1753, the French sent 1,500 soldiers into the area to build forts. They're like, no, please don't come here. We're going to build some fortifications and keep you guys out. This is our area. And I can't pronounce the names of these forts very well, but how one might speak them phonetically, not in a French accent, was Fort Léopold and Fort Manchoualt. I will have to look that up. Robert Derwindy, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, sent George Washington and Christopher Gist to convince the French to leave. They're like, hey, can you guys just leave Ohio and we can occupy this 200,000 acres that we decided to set aside for our citizens? And oddly enough, they failed because the French were like, why would we want to leave? And instead of succeeding, not only did this not go over well, it made the French more mad, and they decided that if any English citizens were to set foot in the Ohio Territory, they'd arrest them. So obviously the tensions are kind of growing here, if you can't tell. George Washington was sent in with the military, and they built Fort Necessity to outrival Fort Duquesne. And in 17 July of 1754, French soldiers and their Native American allies attacked Fort Necessity to drive the English out. And this kind of sparked the start of the French and Indian War. I know the French and Indian War sounds like the French and the Indians were fighting against each other, but it was actually the French and the Native Americans fighting together against the British, which they fought for control of Ohio and most of North America in general, because the French had many colonies in Canada. That's why Quebec has such a French-sounding name, and so is Montreal. So they were fighting for many years, and the Native Americans decided to join the French side because they feared the 2 million colonists, British colonists, that were living on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains would decide that they wanted to move west and would start occupying their lands. Many of these Native Americans had already been pushed out of the East Coast lands and moved into Ohio, which then created tensions with other Native American tribes living there because they're like, hey, what are you doing here? And they're like, well, we had our home and we got pushed out and now we're here. So they were afraid that they would then be forced to move again. And seeing as how there were only about 60,000 French traders, fur traders, living in the Americas at the time, the Native Americans thought they were the better bet because they were just trading and they weren't near the number of people there to come settle the land. So they kind of thought, well, if we're going to have to pick a side, the French were the best bet for them. By 1763, the British emerged as the victors in the war, and this hard-fought war actually won the entire Ohio territory. The British built Fort Pitt soon after this. They had demolished the French fort on the site, and that is now what's known as Pittsburgh. So I thought I'd do a quick overview of the French and Indian War, because that was a lot of information. So kind of think of this as a little tidbit. So the American colonists, they wanted Ohio. And the French were like, no, it's ours. We've been trading here for a while. The Native Americans were like, this is our land too. But the French are less annoying neighbors than the British, so I guess we'll take you. Sometimes it's nicer to have like a quiet neighbor beside you that's not annoying if you have to have a neighbor, rather than the person who's playing loud music every night and constantly throwing their trash on your land or something. So it's kind of, you pick and choose your neighbors sometimes. So then the British built forts, the French attacked, and after 7 years, the British won. If anything had went differently, we might all be speaking French right now. Oui, oui. Strange to think, right? I'm not so good at French, so that would have been bad for me. However, all this fighting that was going on among the Ohio Territory and for the western lands there kind of led into the American Revolution, and we'll get into that another time. But just think of all the war that was fought in this area. Do you think all the muskets and all the fort building and all the soldiers, did that cost money? Yeah, those things are free. The British government spent lots of money taking all these resources over to America so that way they could defend the Ohio Territory and claim it as their own. So needless to say that all this cost a lot of money, and they decided, well, since this cost so much money and the colonists wanted to go live in Ohio, they decided to raise the taxes on the colonists. And the colonists did not like that too well, if you guys know anything about the Boston Tea Party. And that's kind of a whole separate issue. But that kind of led into what we will get into with the American Revolution and how that kind of transpired in Ohio. It's amazing to think that Ohio played such an important role in history. It's not just what happened here. It impacted like the fates of the British and the French empires around the world. It impacted the American Revolution, which then created America and all the things that we have done throughout the centuries here and abroad. So it's just amazing to think that our area that we're living in today has had such a big impact globally. I know we might not think that our area is that big of a deal, but we kind of are. So stay tuned, and if you're worried about the French and Indian War, you can always go learn some French just to make sure. Just kidding, the French and Indian War was hundreds of years ago. I don't think they're coming back. Well, thank you for tuning in, and have a great day. Don't forget to subscribe to Rambling Roxy.